Really curious to hear what you see as some of the bigger challenges that boards are facing when they're preparing for leadership transitions and how they can kind of proactively address some of these changes before a transition becomes necessary.
I think one of the
Thank
things
you.
that makes the answer to that question so difficult is every situation is so unique when it actually comes time for the transition. So the best we can do as boards, which is also for many boards, I think the most difficult, is to be proactive in preparing. And of the board, I've been through 5 CEO transitions, 2 at the same company, just like Cammie, you had 4, you said it, that one company. One of my public board right now, because of my experience, I push every quarter that we really prepare now while we don't need to be preparing, that we prepare for that eventual happening. Like, father time is undefeated. At some point this happens. And, even if it's temporary, somebody gets in an accident or, has to go for a surgery or whatever, like there's so many reasons why we need this. And yet many, many boards and CEOs, and it's in part because of the CEO, finds this really difficult, challenging, and awkward to do.
And I'm curious, as others do pile in, if there have been any kind of surprising lessons that you learned from going through multiple CEO transitions. I know we were talking earlier that no two are the same. So Cammie, any surprising insights or
Yeah,
lessons?
I think one of the lessons is that um, what you need in your CEO is impacted by the context that the company is in. And so, for example, I went through one CEO transition that was very smooth, very well planned. It was an internal candidate. We had developed, had a beautiful development plan. And this individual did quite well for the first few years. But then the external environment shifted dramatically. And the skill set that she came in with wasn't the skill set that the company needed to go forward. So I think, as we were talking a little bit earlier, Vanessa, that you know when you do very good succession planning, you can only look out so far. And so you really have to always be asking, what is the primary leadership experiences that the company needs as we think about the next, kind of 2 to 3 years.
Yeah. I think it's important also to for boards to be willing to change, right? To recognize we thought we were going to need this. The landscape has shifted, and it turns out we need something different. And I see that certainly in my practice as well.
I think
Well,
one
this
other
is where
thing that's interesting on that too is just it's the CEO for sure, but it's also the people around the CEO. And so if you think about phasing a transition, we've done some research and we found that about half of the S&P 500, a little bit less, when they do a transition, moves the former CEO into the executive chair role.
Mm-hmm.
And so depending on the people involved, depending on whether you're changing strategy or not, or changing direction or not, depending on how that outgoing CEO will act in the executive chair role and the impact you want them to have or don't want them to have, I think that's an important piece too, as you think about the transition and getting the new person up to speed. And obviously has comp implications too for how you think about paying people going forward.
Yeah. Greg, I'm curious since you raise it, and I may take us on a little bit of a tangent here, but I promise I'll come back. The notion of keeping a retiring CEO on in an executive chair committee or something of the like. Any thoughts that you can share with us on kind of best practice, when to do that, how to do it effectively, et cetera?
I think it depends. I think the first question you ask is, are we changing direction?
Yeah.
Or are we staying the course? And obviously, if you're staying the course, and especially if you have a new CEO, someone that's not been a public CEO before, an internal promotion, sometimes that executive chair role for the outgoing person can be pretty impactful to give them guidance, and also to signal externally that there will be continuity, and quell any doubts there too. So we've seen it work well. We've seen other situations where the outgoing CEO pushes to be an executive chair and the board doesn't really want him, and that dynamic obviously is less effective. So I think it's important for the board to really drive that and not have it be influenced by the individual, the outgoing individual.
Yeah. Great, thank you. So kind of coming back to this notion of lessons learned. Cammie, I'll start with you on this question, but I welcome others to chime in as well. Are there steps that the board could or should take to try and maintain stability while, kind of managing the inevitable disruption and uncertainty that comes with these transitions?
I definitely think that there are. I think that even in the smoothest, well-planned transition, it's important as board members to recognize that this is a significant event. This is significant emotionally for people. This is significant strategically for people. And, of course, we are all well trained to be noses in and hands out, right? But I think in time of transition, as a board, it's an important time to lean in more. And that takes the form of things like communication with key stakeholders and really making sure that not necessarily that you as a board are doing the communication, but that you are involved in what the key messaging is behind this transition for employees, for the market, for anyone that's a key stakeholder. I think because it's also really important that stakeholders understand the reason for the transition and that it's either a reaffirmation that this is a continuation of a winning strategy and this is why this person is well equipped to do that, or that the company sees that it's time for a new direction and that this is why there's a different set of skills that are required. So I think that messaging is really important to signal that that the board feels confident that they're aligned and that stakeholders should as well. I've also found that, again, even in the smoothest of transitions, that this is a time where outreach to the executive leadership team is usually very important for the board. And there's some relationships that are quite natural, for example, between a CFO and the head of audit, or the head of comp and the CHRO. But I think really having an intentional plan around checking in with with the key leadership employees, because you don't want churn at that level. You want as much stability as possible. And maybe I can flip over to Greg. I think in every situation that I've gone through, we have had some form of an incentive to retain key employees. In some cases, even employees that we felt like might need to change when a new CEO came in.
Yeah.
We wanted to hold on to them during, the 6 months or whatever of transition. So
yeah, retention awards always come up for the rest of the management team, or if you have a little bit of a tournament and the one person that doesn't get the role, retention awards often come up in this context. They're not as common as you might think. About 40-45% of companies will offer them in a transition, and they don't always work. About a third of the people that get them leave anyway. And so what we've seen is most effective when you're thinking about this is sort of targeted, but also the duration of how you think about retention for that team. And where companies may usually have a 3 or 4 year vest on an equity grant, for instance, sometimes for these sorts of awards, it's better to do smaller amounts vesting over a shorter amount of time so that there's not the hangover for the incoming CEO if they have to change and they don't have to manage through that. So being more deliberate about how you use them and using them surgically, and then the design, I think, can be an important piece too. And then the last thing is just having a backup plan if it doesn't work. You know, who's going to step into the CFO's role if the CFO leaves? Is new CEOs coming in? I think there's that second level transition and succession that's important to think through as well on these.
So I want to give an example that ties a couple of these together, going back to the earlier conversation of just how turbulent things are right now. I went through one situation where when generative AI was released, which was November of 22 or 23, anyway, the following March, in one of my companies, we had a board meeting. And there was nothing about generative said in the board meeting, which, because of the industry that we happen to be in and the target market we had, which is marketers, I thought was a little bit weird. So I asked a question like, what do we think the plan is? Didn't get great answers. Long story short, within the next 3 months, we started to have a conversation of the board about the skills that would be needed to shepherd this particular company through the AI disruption. And by the end of that year, we had made a decision to change the CEO. And by the following February, so less than a year later, we had a new CEO with a very, very different skill set. Now, I bring this up in context of this latest discussion because whether it's changes from economic uncertainty or changes from AI disruption or changes because you have new leadership coming in, the ripple effects down through the whole company are enormous. And in that particular case, the new CEO came in. He was the opposite in skills, which we needed. The times are very disrupted right now, especially in the sectors we go after. So one of the company values changed from humble to bold. Like that's the opposite. So I bring all that up to say, as a board, we have to pay attention to the change management processes that are happening in the company. And a lot of companies don't even have good experts in that, and they haven't trained their leaders at all levels in change management. They may or may not have invested in building resilience skills, adaptability skills, critical thinking, problem solving skills. You know, if you've got a company who really invests in that as a culture, fabulous. And the managers know how to manage change. Most companies don't. And so as a board, we have to then really pay attention. Who's helping all of the people through this change? Because the reason the turnover happens at all levels is because the change becomes overwhelming and it's not handled well from the top down. The new CEOs, he's got or she's got a bunch of stuff happening, might not be paying attention to all the change management to make the whole thing a successful transition.
I think these are such great points, and it really speaks to, I think, the need in these times for boards to be more involved versus less involved. And obviously it's a fine line, right? You're not part of the management team, but to really lean into asking the probing questions, and asking them from a place of really wanting to be a source of support, but making sure that those questions are asked so that management teams are tasked with being able to answer them. So thank you for that. Greg, I'm gonna look to you to tell us a little bit about how the landscape of executive compensation has evolved in recent years, and what role the board can play in ensuring that, you know, it's aligning with both company strategy and shareholder expectations when it comes to executive compensation.
I think what we've seen broadly in executive compensation goes back to something Christine said. Like there's one thing. There's a lot of company specific concerns right now. So if your share price is down, you're worried about burn rate. If you're growing and pushing to get profitable, you're worried about stock-based comp expense. If you're an importer, you're worried about tariffs. Everybody that has consumers is worried about the macro now. So broadly, we've seen a lot of those specific to the company. Relative to succession and exec comp design, what we've seen is a little bit more focus on durability of programs. So programs that work well when it's up also work well when it's down. And related to that, a questioning more broadly across institutional investors around the effectiveness of performance shares. And so many of you are probably aware that last year in their policy survey, ISS asked a question about whether performance shares should continue to be part of the program or whether long tail vesting should be viewed as an adequate replacement for that. So something like 5 or 10 years time vesting instead of performance shares. This is an idea that Norges has been talking about for years and years, but more institutional investors are starting to pick up this idea is they're seeing performance share cycles bust and then additional grants flow through. And so I think for succession in particular, that's an important topic because how quickly do you, what do you expect the CEO's tenure to be? And how does that match up if you were to shift to this long tail vesting thing? How does that all work together? I think there's some questions as we look forward to exec comp design and implications that'll be important and really do relate specifically to this succession piece. The other thing that we've seen is that, many years ago, you'd think like, okay, we need staking grants. We need big staking grants for executives to make sure there's skin in the game. For public companies, those don't work as well anymore. Shareholders are really starting to push back on very large upfront grants unless there's a buyout. And so what we've seen through the say on pay votes is that the bar is higher now in terms of justifying upfront grants for people. You really have to talk about they were giving up this amount and we gave them this and this is the annual grant. So there's a lot more disclosure requirements as you're managing through some of these things. So I think both of those trends are important relative to how you think about succession planning and tenure for executives.
I know the real world examples are always helpful, and we've shared some of them already. I'm wondering if we can dig into a couple more of them. And Christine, I'm thinking about, in Silicon Valley, where you tend to see more founder CEOs, right? Kind of startup CEOs who then find themselves running a larger company than they perhaps anticipated, who may or may not have the right skills to really evolve with an organization as it grows. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that experience and how, as a board, you may manage a founder CEO who has run their course and needs to be replaced.
Yep, I've actually seen that done 3 times. Twice really well, once very poorly. The very poorly example was the board deciding that it was time, and I was on that board, by the way. I didn't fully agree with the decision, but I understood the decision. It was a female CEO in that case. Honestly, I think had it been a man, we would have put some scaffolding around the CEO. But in this case, we decided to replace the CEO. Fine, absolutely happens. The way it was done was very poorly done. There wasn't the transparency, the communication, etc. And ultimately, the founder left the company. For good or bad, doesn't matter. In the end, the company is still very successful. It's fine. It just didn't have to be as choppy. I've seen it done twice really well. And in both cases, the then founder CEO was fully involved. In one of those cases, I actually was the incoming CEO. So that's the only reason I know about that one. And it took that board probably a good 12 months to really get the CEO to realize. But part of that process was having the CEO go out to run the search and interview, and through the interview process, start to realize the level of talent and skill that could be available to the company. And so then he kind of got there on his own. And by the time he brought me in, he was ready. And he stayed with the company. He's still one of my dearest friends. We had a fantastic exit a few years later. He was a critical partner, could not have been better. I got super lucky, and he had very high EQ. Another one in one of those boards I said where we transitioned, it was the founder CEO. We brought a CEO in. It worked well for a while. He did a great job. taking a different role. He was ready. And then eventually we had to replace that CEO because the market changed so drastically.
And did you put him, did the founder sit on the board after that, or transition into an exec chair role, or leave?
Yeah, he stayed on the board. I was on the board. He was on the board. The VCs were on the board. And yeah, but I'll tell you, that one could be a case study in just how to do it well. And I don't credit myself with that. I credit the former CEO, because he had the EQ and the maturity to really allow me to do my role. And then I let him, he was the founder, technical visionary. He played his role. We couldn't have been successful without his brilliance.
I can walk through an example of a CEO founder where I think the board did a good job managing a situation that was just a really difficult situation. So we had tried to do all those things that Christine talks about. We had tried to make sure that there was very good communication of gaps in performance. We had involved the CEO in succession planning, and even involved him in bringing in a president to be groomed. And there just was a point where it became clear that his support of what the board felt like was needed was just not there.
Yeah.
So sometimes you just, as a board, are faced with a situation where you have tried to do all the textbook and you're just not on the same page. And so I think that there were some really important lessons in how we went forward that hopefully not many people have to go through, but I'll share them because we were kind of learning as we went. And, one is that in that kind of situation, the board really needs to be aligned. Because if the CEO feels like there's some weakness and that they might pick off some board members, and then of course they're going to do that. So lots of very robust discussions, debates, disagreements, but then a very explicit, we now need to disagree and commit and move forward as a unified team on this. And then, in some ways, really planning for worst case scenario. And it required, as a board, for us to go and bring in our own legal counsel, our own crisis management, to, confidentially work with a search firm to get a sense of what the slate might be out there. And it's so silly, but I've never even thought about these things. Like, you can't pay these people, right? Because you can't tell the company that you are, can't tell the CFO you need to write a retainer check. So you're also, just saying, you got to work with us. I'm good for it. We're good for it once we get through this transition. But finding really good partners was critical, and really understanding the employment contract that we had and all of the ins and outs of that. And also critically important is knowing that you have a strong interim CEO day one. I don't know how you go forward if you can identify, and usually it's someone from the board who is going to step in. And fortunately, in this case, we had someone on the board who really had deep knowledge, and the bandwidth and the willingness to step in. And we had to have a very, very full plan, and then have the conversation with the CEO. And
I'm glad you brought this.
But you had to be, it was go time.
Airtight.
Airtight.
I'm glad you
Um,
brought that up, Cammie, especially about the board trying to do everything right first. Because I think that's the, it doesn't always go right at the end. But in one of those CEO transitions I talked about, the board had decided that the CEO was not the CEO a year prior to all of the change. And I got super uncomfortable because of my last experience, the one that I said was super choppy and didn't need to be. I really felt like the board thought it had been communicating to the CEO about what they expected, but the CEO wasn't really getting the message. Because when you're the CEO, the board tells you 10 million things in every meeting, and you don't really know, like, which ones do I have to pay attention to? Like, my job's on the line, and which ones are opinions and so forth. And I had been watching this play out for a couple of quarters, and I knew that the people with the money, the PE and VC guys, thought they were being clear, but I also knew the CEO had no clue just how serious the situation was. So I asked for permission to sit down with the CEO, with the board. We were totally aligned, but I sat down with that CEO and said, your job's on the line. If these shifts don't happen, then you no longer have this opportunity. And he had no idea that in fact is. Now, his credit really leaned in. He made a bunch of changes. It wasn't perfect, but it was significantly better. Now, fast forward another 6 months, and then I became the one that was saying, I think we have a problem, because the market dynamics had shifted, and he wasn't the person to shift with it. So I look back now and I think, if I wouldn't have stepped in, we might have got a CEO sooner. Maybe it would have been the right one, maybe not. But was that the right thing to do or not? But I do think the right thing to do as a board is always make sure that if somebody's job is truly on the line, that they know it and that they have some opportunity to course correct with that information before you then, and we had to do the same thing, Cammie. It was like, all right, now we got a plan because this thing is going to happen. We got to have somebody step in as an interim, all the stuff you said. And we did, but due process matters in this, and you will feel better if you have the right due process.
Absolutely. That is just treating people with
Dignity.
respect and dignity.
Yeah.
It's interesting. There's a whole body of work on kind of process justice versus, kind of outcomes and procedural justice. And it all points to, even if one doesn't like the outcome, if you feel you've been treated fairly in the process, you can sit with it much better. And I think this is a great illustration of just how important that is. If a CEO is able to come to that conclusion on their own, that's great. If they're not, and they're, hanging on for dear life, and ultimately you need to sever that cord, if they feel it was a fair and just process, it's likely going to be a smoother transition in what is, by definition, an imperfect scenario. Yeah, Christine.
One final point on that one, very unusual. The CEO that we replaced, we did bring in an interim. It was the previous CEO who was the founder, et cetera. We gave the outgoing CEO the opportunity to address the whole company when we did the transition. And I pushed for that really hard. He did an absolutely fantastic job saying, times have changed. I've done my time. I'm proud. I'm handing it back. Here's the plan going forward. I support. Everybody in the whole company, including the person we were replacing, including the board, felt so much better because we offered him that opportunity to say goodbye with dignity. We thanked him for his contributions, which, by the way, were many. But because we went through that due process, it was a substantially better outcome.
I remember years ago, someone gave me the advice that the way that you exit people has such an impact on the people who are remaining. So always do it with grace and dignity.
I always say it's the most important day in the life of your company, like your career with that company. The most important day is the day you leave and how you do it.
Listening to you both, it also strikes me that the board leadership structure is important in this too. So, whether it's a chairman or a lead director or whatever, that you have somebody that can actually have that conversation effectively with the sitting CEO to make sure
Yeah.
that.
Well, and the other just tiny little thing, but I think can be important is when there are contentious situations, it's good to have the lead director plus another director
Right.
in the room. I think
Right.
anytime there are these kinds of difficult conversations, it's valuable to have another voice and another set of eyes.
Right. And in the case of one of those, we, when we were trying to help the CEO be successful after giving the feedback, we brought in a coach for that person. Now, in that case, it ended up being me, and he wanted that, but it wouldn't, it could easily have been somebody from the outside. It kind of doesn't matter. But then I sat in on the discussion when we made a change because I felt it was as much on me as on him that we were unable to really get him into the full capacity we needed, particularly with the drastic change in the externals with AI.
These are such great great points of counsel. I'm curious because you both mentioned, and I see that the question came up in the chat as well around having a director take an interim CEO role, and it sounds like in both the examples that you gave that there was a plan for that. And I'll throw this question really out to any of you in terms of thinking about how important is it to have kind of an immediate emergency interim successor who's sitting on the board, who's able to dive in case of an unplanned succession, and do the boards that you sit on, is that kind of standard practice or not?
I'll offer a quick point of view. Just generally, what I think immediate successor is a must-have. I don't think it has to be a board member. We've seen it be effective. If it's a general counsel, sometimes can step in because there's no expectation that person will be permanent, most likely. But as somebody to shepherd and manage can be pretty effective, depending on what the circumstances are that led to the departure in the first place.
Yeah.
So that's what we've seen.
Agree with
It really kind of depends.
Yeah, certainly you need a plan for either the permanent successor, which is obviously the best, or at least for an interim. And in that case, you might need a couple depending on the circumstances. In the Me Too moment transition CEO replacement example that I went through, we ended up having to replace the CEO very, very quickly. By the way, after a full investigation and so forth. My big learning there was that was the second investigation. So where there is smoke, there is fire. And we could have a whole session just around board's role and key learnings on that kind of situation. But when we brought the successor in, he was the named permanent successor. And I was saying in one of our prep sessions that there was always a little bit of a question, not his capabilities and integrity and any of that. Obviously, he was the named successor, but his skill sets were very, very different from the CEO we had. And so had it been a planned transition over time, we would have had time to debate that and right timing, et cetera, but we didn't. And so we went from a CEO with one set of skills to a CEO with an opposite set of skills, very much like what Apple did with Steve Jobs to Tim Cook, like very, very different personalities. And it worked out brilliantly. It turned out we probably needed him way more than we realized, and that skill set way more than we had realized. But had we gone out in the open market to look for somebody, we wouldn't necessarily have looked for somebody with those skills. So that was just a very happy surprise, but that was a big learning for me.
Great, thank you. Greg, I'm wondering if you can share maybe a specific example as we think about, kind of real world scenarios of a perhaps creative compensation approach or strategy that was effective in perhaps a tense CEO succession process.
One that comes to mind is a situation where it was an internal promotion, but it was a CEO that had a very different view for the strategy of the company. So this was a company that had had been focused largely on margin, on profitability, on returns, with some growth, but kind of equal balance perspective. And so you might think that then, the comp program stays the course. But this new CEO came in and wanted a growth mandate, felt that they were going to get multiple expansion if they could demonstrate higher growth, that maybe they'd been sacrificing some of the R&D they should have been spending in order to drive some of that growth. And so I think largely he was named CEO because the board agreed with that point of view. And so in that circumstance, what we did is change the pay program to support that strategic choice and strategic shift, and not in a way that was really necessarily driving behavior, but was supportive in terms of the messaging to the organization. So we removed return on capital from the long-term incentives, amped the emphasis on revenue growth up, shift the mix of vehicles to be heavier on options and performance shares with more leverage than we'd had in the past tied to these things. And so I think, often comp comes in behind the strategy and is supportive and doesn't get in the way. And that's what happened in this case. And I think you can probably apply that example to any time you have a leadership transition and priorities are shifting. It could have been the opposite in a different circumstance. But I think that's just a good example of how the pay program can support those other priorities at the leadership level.
That's fantastic. Thank you. One of the things I'm curious about is, we've talked a lot about some of these kind of emergency situations or founders that we've had to coach out. How do you, and Christine, I'll start with you on this, but again, anyone chime in. When a CEO is performing well and perhaps new in role and, everything is going great, how do you get them to start thinking about long-term succession and really building that strong bench, even when times are good?
Oh my God, I wish you wouldn't have come to me, because I just put a note in. This is the freaking hardest part, is you need to plan when times are good.
Yeah.
And it's really difficult, especially if you have a young board and you've got people on the board who are not super into governance or don't have a lot of experience. It's like pushing on a string. And it's like you're in there in the board meeting saying, this is really important, we really need to do this. But if the CEO isn't supportive and driving it, and or the chair isn't supportive and driving it, it doesn't matter how much Nom and Gov wants to do it, or the chair of Nom and Gov or whatever. It's very difficult for it to happen. And so then I think it's really about socializing these examples and case studies, and things on boards happen very slowly. I learned early in my board career, you have to be super patient. It's not a virtue of mine. So you just start introducing, and every quarter you just push a little bit on that string, and you just offer something, and you maybe take one tiny cut. Let's just talk about it in terms of if there was an accident, like who internally would step in under what circumstances. You just start easing in.
That's a great point.
The other thing you could do is look at things like typical board calendars or typical comp committee calendars, and what's on the agenda at these times. Oh, succession planning. Oh, maybe we should do succession planning at this time, and that might be another avenue that's lower risk for everybody to approach.
Yeah, well, yeah. And there's always excuses though. When people don't want to really have succession plans at any level, including the next level down, there's always good excuses. And it makes it hard as a board member. There's only so much you can do. And when you've seen it done really well and you've seen the value, it. But when people haven't seen that and they don't know it, again, you're back to pushing on the string.
Yeah. Cammie, I'm interested to hear any thoughts that you may have on culture and how boards can help, organizations preserve, hopefully, the good aspects of culture, switch any negative aspects during these transition times.
Well, one thing I have really believe is that, we should first think about our culture as a board. And I think whenever there's a CEO transition, it is a wonderful time to really pause And you are a new board at that point, because typically, with a new CEO, you've got a new board member. And with the last CEO transition that I went through on a board, we actually had some NACD faculty come in and do a really robust workshop with us on, hey, this is a chance. One, we've gone through some challenging things. Anytime you go through a transition, there's learnings you want to capture. But really reflecting on the behaviors that we wanted to stop, start, and continue, and looking at it as an opportunity, tone at the top to show that that culture is something that you need to be intentional about. And then certainly encouraging the CEO to also take a look at the vision and values of the company and use it as an opportunity to reaffirm what's really important in the DNA in the company, and to make shifts if there's something that's necessary to really support the strategy. But like we say, never waste a good crisis. I would also say never waste a transition as a time to really double down on looking at your culture and reaffirming and making any tweaks.
And I'll throw this question really out to all of you. We mentioned at the top of the call that the majority of boards say that there's room for improvement in terms of the relationship between boards and CEOs. Any thoughts, particularly, to your point, Cammie, never waste a good transition, particularly in the vein of transition. Are there things that boards can do to use that moment in time to really start to secure a productive and constructive dynamic between the board and CEO?
I mean, I do think it's about having really open conversations. And again, in this culture session we also wanted the CEO to put their perspective into the room about what they had seen work elsewhere, and to help shape the board culture, not just to walk into an existing board culture. But I think also it's going back to what we were talking about earlier. It is such a great opportunity to make sure that there is a really good dynamic between the board and the CEO of very candid, very honest feedback. And making sure, I for one am a big believer that, along with, of course, all the financial metrics that the CEO is being rewarded on, that there ought to be explicit goals in terms of some of the underlying initiatives that drive the metrics, whether it's building out a new executive team, whether it is taking a look at a new approach to capital allocation, or whatever it is. You want to have an explicit statement of those things that the board is expecting that the CEO is going to focus on in the coming year. And then after every board meeting, there needs to be very honest discussions. There always needs to be an executive session. Part of that executive session needs to be the board aligning on, these are the messages that the chair, the lead director, needs to take back to the CEO, both in terms of the meeting itself and those dynamics, but as well on how we think we are making progress, or where there are concerns about how we're moving forward against the strategy. So I just can't say enough about using this as a chance to set up good feedback mechanisms.
So I'm aware that we only have about 5 minutes left. It's amazing how quickly an hour can go by. I'd love for each of you maybe to give us some parting thoughts, one or two really key takeaways that would be helpful for everybody on this call to be thinking about. Greg, I'll start with you. What are your 1 to 2 key takeaways?
Well, one is I think the pay program and the role of the pay program relative to what the CEO is trying to drive, I think, is critical. Making sure those are aligned, making sure that you evaluate it periodically, and making sure that it works, both philosophically aligned, but also delivering the outcomes you want and that are aligned. And then the other thing I would say is, being intentional about roles and responsibilities and the transition that you have, and making sure that you have the right, I think someone used the word scaffolding around the person, both on the board and in the management team, as you go through these transitions, I think are two important things to think about.
Great. Thank you. Christine, any key takeaways?
The one thing I'll just as a seed I'll plant is, as a board, pay a lot of attention to your information flows and where and how you're getting information, how closely it's managed. You know, it is the noses in, fingers out, but your ability to understand lots of things about the company, including the performance of the CEO, potential problems, opportunities, blind spots, et cetera, is only as good as your information flow.
Great point.
I think mine would be that trust is so important to being able to have the open and honest and critical conversations that you need to have as a board, that you need to have between the board and the CEO, particularly in any kinds of difficult times. And I'm a big believer that that trust is built in spending time together. So I'm really glad that we are now post-COVID and back to having board dinners and board breakfasts, because I really do think personal relationships are a key component to being able to have the trust that enables the honest conversations.
Yeah. Well, I just want to thank you all so much for a spirited and open and honest conversation on a very, very timely and important topic. I know there were many, many avenues that you could pursue on a webinar in and of itself, but really appreciate all of you taking the time. Lisa, Kate, the whole NACD team, appreciate you giving us a platform to have this conversation. Appreciate everyone who took time out of their day to attend, and keep the conversation going.